It is the morning of April 5th, 1909, in Phoenix, Arizona. A reader unfolds a copy of the Arizona Gazette over breakfast and finds a headline that stops the coffee cup halfway to the mouth. Explorations in Grand Canyon, mysteries of immense rich cavern being brought to light. The story names an explorer, G.E. Kincaid, who claims to have found a vast man-made cavern carved into the canyon wall, thousands of feet above the Colorado River, reachable only by boat and only at the right water level. It says a Smithsonian scientist, Professor S.A. Jordan, has joined him, and that what they are pulling out of the dark is nothing less than proof that a lost civilization, possibly Egyptian, walked this canyon thousands of years before anyone thought a human being had set foot in Arizona. Copper tools, golden urns, rows of seated mummies, hieroglyphics no one can read, statues that look like they belong in a temple on the Nile, sitting in the dust of a cave in the American Southwest. The article promises more to come. 4 days later, on April 9th, the paper delivers with a follow-up full of fresh detail, fresh measurements, fresh wonder, and then silence. Total, permanent, history-swallowing silence. No photographs, no artifacts in any museum ever, no scientific paper, no second newspaper anywhere in the country picking up what should have been the biggest archaeological story of the 20th century. Kincaid disappears from public record, Jordan disappears from public record. The Smithsonian, when anyone bothers to ask, says the same 6 words for the next 115 years. We have no record of this. For over a century, that has been the entire shape of the mystery. A newspaper story too strange to be forgotten, and an institution too silent to be believed. And into that century-old silence, in 2024 and 2025, researchers started doing something new. They started asking an artificial intelligence, Grok, built by XAI, to actually look at everything at once, not just the Gazette clipping, not just the Smithsonian's denial, but the geology of the canyon's cave systems, the archaeological record of the Southwest, and the oral traditions of the Hopi people, who have lived beside this canyon for over 1,000 years and whose creation story describes an entire underground world their ancestors once called home. The question people wanted answered was simple and electric. Does everything line up? Was the 1909 story secretly true, and did a modern AI just prove it? Here is what I found when I actually chased that question down, past the headline and into the sources. It is not the answer most of these videos give you. It is better because it is real and because it does not require throwing an actual Native American people's sacred history under the bus to make a good story. So stay with me, because the true version of this is still one of the strangest, most human stories in American history, and it deserves to be told without the fabrication. Let's start with the newspaper story itself, because you cannot understand what Grok or anyone else can honestly say about this until you understand exactly what the Arizona Gazette actually printed, and exactly how thin it was from the very first sentence. The Gazette was a real, functioning daily paper in Phoenix in 1909. That part is true, and it matters, because it is the one fact that keeps this story alive. A real newspaper's byline gives a hoax a kind of borrowed legitimacy that pure fiction never gets. But look closely at what the article actually contains. It names a lone traveler, Kincaid, who says he found the cave while boating down the Colorado, then says he happened to team up with a Smithsonian professor named Jordan for the dig. There is no photograph. There is no named eyewitness besides the 2 men at the center of the story. There is no second source, no wire service pickup, no competing paper in Tucson or Flagstaff or anywhere else in the country running so much as a paragraph on it. In an era when American newspapers reprinted each other constantly, when any real discovery of Egyptian-style ruins in the Grand Canyon would have been the single biggest story on the continent, exactly one paper carried it one time, with one follow-up, and then nothing, forever. Researchers who have gone looking for Kincaid and Jordan in Smithsonian personnel files, census records, expedition rosters, anywhere a real early 20th century professional would leave paperwork, have come up empty for 115 years. The Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology has stated, repeatedly and consistently since people first started asking, that it has no file on a Professor Jordan, no file on a G.E. Kincaid, and no record of any Grand Canyon excavation matching the story at all. Some researchers have pointed out that a real Smithsonian-affiliated scientist named David Starr Jordan existed around that period and even explored the Grand Canyon in 1898. And that a man named Kincaid accompanied him on an unrelated Alaska expedition years earlier. It is a genuinely interesting historical coincidence, the kind that makes conspiracy theories breathe. But the actual Smithsonian archive holds nothing connecting either man to the cave, the mummies, or the 1909 article. A coincidence of 2 similar names, floating around the same institution decades apart, is not evidence of a cover-up. It is exactly the kind of loose thread a skilled hoax writer in 1909, working from a newspaper morgue full of real names, might have pulled on without anyone ever intending a secret to exist. And there is a term for what this story actually is, once you step back from it. Yellow journalism. The early 1900s were the golden age of the American newspaper hoax. papers routinely ran entirely fabricated stories of monsters, lost civilizations, and impossible discoveries to sell copies on slow news days, because there was no wire service fact-checking, no photography requirement, and often no legal consequence at all. One traveling hoax writer of that exact era, a man named Joseph Mulhattan, became so notorious for planting fake discovery stories in regional papers that his name briefly became a verb, to be Mulhattaned, meaning to be taken in by an obvious newspaper fabrication. The Grand Canyon cave story follows that template with almost textbook precision. An unverifiable lone witness, an invented credentialed partner to lend authority, a promise of more to come, one follow-up article to keep the excitement alive, and then total silence once the news cycle moved on. It did not need a cover-up to disappear. It disappeared the way every other fabricated 1909 wonder story disappeared, because it was never real in the first place, and there was nothing left to report. Now let's talk about why the Smithsonian silence has been mistaken for suppression for over a century, because this is the part that genuinely deserves a fair hearing before we move on. In 1906, 3 years before the Gazette story ran, Congress passed the Antiquities Act, which gave the federal government real legal authority over significant archaeological finds on federal land, and the Grand Canyon already sat under federal protection at that point. It is true that if a discovery of that scale had actually been made there, the government would have had every legal mechanism available to manage it quietly rather than announce it. That fact is real, and it is the single strongest card any cover-up theory has to play, because it explains why an institution might stay silent about something true. But having a mechanism that could theoretically enable a cover-up is not evidence that a cover-up happened. It only means silence by itself proves nothing either way. And in this specific case, the far simpler explanation carries all the actual weight. No photographs exist, because none were ever taken. No artifacts sit in any collection, because none were ever found. And no second reporter confirmed the story, because there was nothing there to confirm. The Antiquities Act explains why a real discovery could have been hidden. It does not explain why we should assume, against every other piece of available evidence, that this particular discovery was real in the first place. So, that is the newspaper half of the story, laid out honestly. A compelling, well-written hoax from a genuinely wild era of American journalism, kept alive for over a century by exactly one thing. The fact that we have no record of this sounds a lot more sinister than this never happened, even when the second explanation is almost certainly the true one. Now let's talk about the Hopi, and I want to be careful here, because this is where a lot of these videos go wrong in a way that actually does harm. The Hopi are one of the oldest continuously inhabited cultures in North America, with villages on the mesas of northern Arizona that have stood for over 1,000 years, and an oral tradition and clan history that reaches back long before that. Central to Hopi belief is the emergence tradition, the account of humanity passing through a series of prior worlds, each ending in catastrophe, with the ancestors eventually climbing up through a sacred opening in the earth, called the Sipapu, into the present world. Within this tradition, different clan histories describe beings who existed in the world below, including accounts, recorded by anthropologists across the 20th century, of a people the Hopi call the Ant People, or Anu Sinom, who are described in some tellings as having sheltered and fed the ancestors during a time of catastrophe. This is a real, sacred living belief system, held by a real nation of people today, and it deserves to be treated the way any people's origin story deserves to be treated, as a meaningful account of who they are and where they come from, not as a set of clues to be mined for evidence of a tabloid story that has nothing to do with them. That's an important distinction, so let's sit with it for a second. The Hopi emergence tradition is not a description of a literal, geographically locatable underground city. It is a foundational spiritual narrative, the way Genesis is for Judaism and Christianity, or the Dreamtime is for Aboriginal Australian traditions. Treating it as a literal treasure map and then acting surprised when its imagery of underground worlds and underground beings matches a hoax newspaper story about underground chambers is not actually a discovery. It's a coincidence built entirely out of the fact that underground worlds and underground beings are two of the oldest, most widespread story elements in human culture, appearing independently in the mythology of cultures on every inhabited continent, with no newspaper hoax required to explain any of them. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office has, in fact, addressed the Grand Canyon directly in an official capacity, and what they have said is worth actually hearing rather than paraphrasing into a mystery. They have identified specific areas within the canyon as sacred and culturally sensitive and asked outside parties, tourists, researchers, treasure hunters to respect those places rather than treat them as sites for excavation or exploration. That is not a wink and nod confirmation of a hidden Egyptian mummy cave. It is a nation asking, in plain language, to be left alone in the places that matter to them, after over a century of exactly the kind of outside speculation this video topic represents, I think that's worth genuinely sitting with before we go any further. There's another layer to this worth pulling apart, because it explains why this particular hoax has outlived almost every other tall tale from that era. Most 1909 newspaper hoaxes died within weeks, because they had nothing to hold on to once the initial excitement faded. This one had two things going for it that most of its competitors didn't. First, it borrowed the name of a real, prestigious, still existing institution, which meant that a century later, curious readers could still write a real letter to a real address and get a real response, keeping the story alive generation after generation in a way a purely invented organization never could. Second, it arrived at almost the perfect cultural moment, an era when the dominant academic model insisted that the peoples of the Americas had developed in total isolation from the civilizations of the Old World, with no contact, no shared influence, nothing. A story that promised to blow that isolation model apart, that promised a hidden thread connecting Arizona to Egypt, tapped directly into a public appetite for exactly that kind of overturning everything we know narrative, the same appetite that still drives lost civilization content today. It wasn't secret government suppression that kept this story circulating for over a century. It was the far more human combination of a borrowed institutional name, a genuinely exciting premise, and just enough ambiguity in the historical record to let each new generation of researchers rediscover it and wonder all over again whether this might be the one hoax that turns out to be true. It's also worth being honest about how thoroughly people have actually gone looking for evidence over the decades, because nobody has found anything only means something once you know real effort was put into looking. Historians, folklorists, and independent researchers have combed through National Archives records, Smithsonian correspondence files, Arizona territorial records, and period newspaper archives from across the country, hunting for any trace of Kincaid, Jordan, a funded expedition, a purchase order, a travel voucher, anything a real government-linked dig in 1909 would have generated as ordinary paperwork. None of it exists. Compare that to genuine early 20th century archaeological expeditions of the period, which left behind exactly the kind of paper trail you'd expect. Correspondence, itemized expense records, specimen catalogs, follow-up publications in academic journals. The 1909 Grand Canyon story left behind precisely 2 newspaper articles and nothing else, in a decade when the federal government was quite good at generating paperwork for far smaller undertakings. That absence isn't proof of a cover-up so thorough it erased its own bureaucracy. It's the far more mundane signature of a story that was never filed anywhere in the first place, because there was never a real expedition to file paperwork about. Now, here's the part where I think the true story actually gets more interesting than the fake one, not less. The Grand Canyon really does contain vast, genuinely unexplored cave systems, and that part has nothing to do with the 1909 hoax at all. The canyon is not simply a valley cut by a river. It is a stack of rock layers representing close to 2 billion years of Earth's history. And one of those layers, the Redwall Limestone Formation, roughly 500 feet thick in places, is exactly the kind of rock where water dissolves stone over geological time and leaves behind caves, passages, and chambers. The canyon is known to contain over 1,000 documented caves, and only a small fraction of them have ever been formally surveyed, largely because so much of the canyon's interior is only reachable by river or by technical climbing on sheer cliff faces. Some of the caves that have been surveyed have produced real, extraordinary finds, just not the kind the 1909 hoax promised. Split twig figurines, small woven animal shapes left by people who lived in the region thousands of years before the ancestral Puebloans, have been recovered from Redwall limestone caves and radiocarbon dated to as early as 4,000 years ago, offering genuine evidence of ceremonial activity deep inside the canyon's cave systems, long before written history in the region begins. That's a real archaeological discovery, sitting quietly in the same rock layer the hoax writer chose for his fictional cavern, and it gets a fraction of the attention the fake story gets, purely because it doesn't come with mummies attached. In 2019, researchers using LiDAR, a laser-based remote sensing technology capable of mapping terrain through vegetation and shadow, identified previously undocumented cave openings in sections of the canyon that had long been considered thoroughly explored. Some of those openings sit in exactly the kind of remote, river access-only stretches of cliff that the 1909 hoax article described. That's the genuinely wild, true fact hiding underneath all of this. You don't need a fabricated mummy cave to have a real Grand Canyon mystery. The canyon is still, to this day, keeping real secrets in places no modern human being has ever set foot. So where does Grok actually fit into an honest version of this story? Not as an oracle that cross-referenced ancient secrets and found a smoking gun. That framing sounds impressive, but it misunderstands what a language model actually does, and more importantly, it isn't what happens when you honestly ask one. I went and put the real question to Grok directly, the same way any curious viewer could. Is the 1909 Arizona Gazette Grand Canyon story true? And does it connect to real Hopi tradition? And the honest answer it gives, when you ask it straight, is not a secret revelation. It is the same conclusion that historians, folklorists, and the Smithsonian itself have reached for decades. The 1909 article shows every hallmark of a fabricated early 20th century newspaper hoax, no corroborating evidence, for it has ever surfaced in over a century of searching and Hopi oral tradition, while it does describe an underground emergence and underground beings, is a sacred belief system describing spiritual and ancestral history, not a literal cave system that happens to match a Phoenix newspaper's fiction from 1909. A well-built AI system doesn't manufacture a cover-up out of two unrelated stories that both happen to mention underground. It does the more useful thing. It holds the newspaper hoax up to the light, holds the Hopi tradition up to the light, separately and with respect for what each one actually is, and it tells you plainly that dressing one up as proof of the other does a disservice to both. That, to me, is the actually fascinating twist in this story, and it's a true one. For over 100 years, human beings wanted this hoax to be real so badly that they kept reaching for anything that might prop it up, including borrowing the sacred history of a living people who never asked to be part of the story at all. And now that we have tools that can hold enormous amounts of information at once and reason across it without an ego or a career or a YouTube thumbnail on the line, the honest answer those tools give isn't the dramatic one, it's the responsible one. The hoax stays a hoax. The Hopi tradition stays exactly what the Hopi say it is on their own terms. And the real mystery, the actual unexplored caves cut into 2 billion years of rock, stays standing on its own, without needing anyone's fabricated Egyptian city to make it worth caring about. I think there's something worth taking away from that, beyond just this one canyon. We live in a moment where it is incredibly easy to feed a pile of unrelated sources into an AI system and ask it to find you a pattern. And it is worth remembering that pattern finding is not the same thing as truth finding. If you ask a system a leading question, built to connect a debunked tabloid hoax to a real people's sacred origin story, you can absolutely get an answer back that sounds like a chilling revelation. But that answer would be reflecting the shape of the question you asked, not some deeper reality that 100 years of historians missed. The actually responsible use of a tool like Grok in a story like this one is to ask it the honest question and let it give you the honest, less cinematic answer, which is exactly what happens if you try it yourself. The 1909 story fails every basic test of a real discovery. No photographs, no artifacts, no second witness, no institutional record, in an era when a find like that would have made front pages coast to coast. The Hopi tradition passes every test of what it actually is, a real, continuously preserved, deeply meaningful account of a people's origins, entirely on its own terms, without needing a Phoenix newspaper from 1909 to validate it. And the canyon itself, the actual physical Grand Canyon, doesn't need any of this either. It is already one of the most geologically significant places on the surface of the Earth, holding rock layers that stretch back further than complex life itself, containing well over 1,000 caves that have never been fully mapped, in terrain so remote and vertical that entire sections of it remain functionally unseen by any modern person. Millions of visitors stand on the rim every year and see the postcard version, the overlooks and the mule trails and the visitor center, and have no idea that beneath their feet, inside the Redwall limestone, there are passages that LiDAR only found by accident in 2019, in a park that has been intensively studied for over a century. That is not a manufactured mystery. That is a real one, sitting there, waiting for the kind of patient, respectful, properly resourced exploration that has nothing to do with mummies or Egypt or a hoax from a Phoenix newspaper that nobody could ever verify. So here's where I actually land on this after chasing every thread of it down. The 1909 Arizona Gazette story is almost certainly what it looks like. A well-crafted piece of early 20th century newspaper fiction, built in an era that had no fact-checking infrastructure and a real appetite for exactly this kind of sensational discovery story kept alive for over a century, not because the evidence supports it, but because no record exists, is an unsettling sentence that people naturally want to fill in with something more dramatic than the truth. The Hopi emergence tradition is real, sacred, and belongs to the Hopi people, who have preserved it with a level of care and continuity that deserves genuine respect, not repurposing as circumstantial evidence for somebody else's tabloid mystery. And the real caves of the Grand Canyon, unmapped, unexplored, cut into some of the oldest exposed rock on the planet, are a genuinely open scientific question that modern tools like LiDAR are only just beginning to answer. If you want the honest thrill in this story, it isn't a secret Egyptian mummy chamber that the Smithsonian buried for 100 years. It's the fact that a place as intensively visited, photographed, and studied as the Grand Canyon can still, in the 21st century, surprise us with cave openings nobody knew were there. It's the fact that a nation of people can preserve an origin story across 1,000 years with enough precision and integrity that anthropologists are still documenting new detail from it today. And it's the fact that when you actually ask a modern AI system the honest version of a century-old question, instead of the leading version, it gives you back something more useful than a conspiracy. It gives you clarity. The Grand Canyon does not need a hoax to be extraordinary. It already is one of the most extraordinary places on Earth, and the true story underneath it, the geology, the Hopi history on its own terms, and the century-long life of a newspaper hoax that refuses to die, is more than enough to keep any curious mind up at night. There's a reason stories like this keep resurfacing every few years with a new technological coat of paint, whether it's satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, or now a language model asked to find patterns across old documents. Each new tool arrives, someone points it at the same century-old hoax, and for a moment it feels like this could finally be the generation that proves it. But the honest use of any of those tools points the same direction every time, back to a well-documented newspaper fabrication, a sacred tradition that was never meant to answer questions it wasn't asked, and a real canyon that keeps producing genuine discoveries for anyone patient enough to look at what's actually there instead of what a headline from 1909 wanted them to imagine. If this kind of deep dive, separating the real history from the internet mythology, is something you want more of, let me know in the comments what other lost civilization story you want put through the same honest process. There are a lot of them out there, and most of them, just like this one, turn out to have a true story underneath them that's stranger and better than the fake version ever was.